Well, Saydean, thank you once again for agreeing to do this interview with us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
Thank you. Well, maybe we could begin toward the beginning, and I could ask you a little bit about your family background and youth. And I believe you were born in 1940 in Philadelphia. Is that right?
Philadelphia, yes.
Yeah. Please, yeah.
Oh,
I just want to know if you could tell us a little bit about your family background.
oh, sure. Let's see. When I was 3 years old, I thought I was adopted, if you really want to know. And I thought I'd run away, but then I thought my parents might be really upset, and then I would go back to sleep. Okay. But I grew up there, and it was the 40s, the 50s, and there was a time when women didn't quite have as much say as they do today. So I do remember a few things growing up, but I went all the way through college in Philadelphia.
Could you tell us a little bit about your parents, what your father did for a career and
Sure.
his interests?
My father was a salesman, and he got in his car every day and he went traveling. He was a furniture salesman. So my parents didn't have that much money, and they kind of saved it all for my brother so he could go to college. So I wound up going to Temple University.
And what was your family name?
Oh, my family name was Smith, and I was very happy to change it because when I was growing up, they had my first name, which I also changed because I was born Saydean. And when I was in kindergarten, my teacher mispronounced it, and I said, I like this one better. And that's how I became Saydean. But when I went to, when I was in high school and I was growing up, then if I went to a party, someone would say, gee, what's your name? And I'd say Saydean, and they say, what's your last name? And I'd say Smith, and they'd say, oh, you got to be kidding. So I was happy to change my name.
And what did you live in one area primarily in Philadelphia, or did you move around? Yeah.
Well, when I was smaller, we lived in West Philadelphia, but we moved when I was about 8. We moved to the Northeast Philadelphia, and I don't. Have you ever been to Philadelphia? Okay, so there's houses that are either all connected together, kind of like Baltimore, or some of them are semi-detached, where there's just one other house next to you. And it's kind of hard to, unless you really know where you're going, it's really hard to find your own house.
And you went to the public high schools in Philadelphia?
I did. I went to Olney High School in Philadelphia.
And oftentimes in families, there's like a kind of like a predominant theme in the household. You know, sometimes it's like a very business-oriented family, or politics, or religion, or education. Would you say that there was kind of a theme like that in your household? Some strong characteristics?
No. Oh, well, I guess my mother was she was a little weird, my mother. So right after the First World War, the Second World War, sorry, the second one, she opened a hosiery store, and that was going to be really good because they didn't have that during the war, and she was making really good money. And so my father decided, well, maybe I don't have to go out and work anymore. And she said, okay, that's it. I'm shutting down the hosiery store. So she was She was not. She was not a feminist, but she kind of was in some way. You know. So she decided to do all sorts of charity things after that.
What would be an example of some of the charity work that she did?
She was very active in the local synagogue, and then she became the president of the Philadelphia Society for Brotherhood. It was the Brotherhood Society, where all these people are supposed to be now equal, right? Until a black family moved down the street from us. She didn't like that too much. So she was a very weird character.
You talked about some of the challenges, discrimination that you faced, you know, because of your gender in those times. Did you also experience those sorts of issues around being Jewish?
No, because the neighborhood we lived in was predominantly Jewish. The first time I realized I was a minority was I went with a friend of mine during, just before my last semester in college, and we went on a student ship to Paris for the summer. And I said, oh, this is what they mean, because we were the only two Jewish people on the whole boat.
Okay.
But so growing up, I didn't realize that there was an issue on that front.
And what kind of, you know, in your youth, you know, what was really interesting you? What were you attracted to? Were you a big reader? What sort of activities really engaged you? Maybe before you got to college.
Well, when I was 8, I had rheumatic fever. And so I was home for a year. It was the year before penicillin. So I couldn't get out of bed. My mother had to carry me to the bathroom because this was the protocol for rheumatic fever at the time. So I read a lot and listened to the radio a lot.
Did you continue with being a big reader? Was the library an important place for you?
Oh yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I never really liked real books. I like mythology. I still kind of like science fiction and stuff like that, you know, fantasy.
And the library was the primary place that you got access to that?
I did, or I also, well, when I was home for that year, my mother brought me books. I had lots of those.
And what about in high school? What was your experience like in high school? How did you do inside the classroom? Did you have activities that you were pursuing outside the classroom?
Trying to remember what I did in high school other than I worked a lot because I had to pay for my way to go to Paris for the summer, so I had 4 jobs.
Wow.
So I worked for what's that big company that does polling? Gallup polls. Okay. Gallup polls, right? So I would call people on the phone. Okay, then I had another job where I was stood on the street corner and interviewing people, because that was where the money was like $5 an hour. That was really good stuff. And then I worked in the Museum of Art school, in the school store there. And what was the third, fourth? Oh, and I worked in university in the solid state labs.
Really? Yeah. At Temple University?
At Temple, yeah.
Yeah. Well, could you talk a little bit about, you know, I think when you went to Temple University, you initially went in to be a physics major, if I'm
right.
Right. Mm-hmm. And could you talk about kind of what led you up to that? Had you excelled in mathematics and the sciences in high school?
Well, I had scholarships in mathematics, but I had one boyfriend in high school, and I was dancing with him one night, and I asked him what he was going to be doing when he graduated high school. He said, "Oh, I'm going to be a physicist." And I said, "Oh, what's that?" He said, "Oh, you wouldn't understand." That's when I decided that I was going to major in physics. So that's what I did.
But your original intention had been mathematics.
Yeah, I like math.
Yeah.
Especially abstract math.
Was it at Temple that you first had direct experience with the computer?
No, I didn't have. There weren't any computers at Temple that I remember. I mean, that I know of.
Right.
No, my first experience with a computer was when I graduated. I went to work for General Electric Space Sciences Lab in Valley Forge.
Okay.
And that's where I ran into, first the usual Marchand machine. And, it was a step up from my slide rule, though, but which I still have.
From college or from high school?
From college too. Yeah. That's what we used.
So you were at Temple in the later 1950s, is that right?
Yes, I was there for 3.5 years. They wouldn't let me continue because I had taken all these graduate courses, and they said, "That's enough. You have to graduate." Because I had the scholarship and I wanted to make the best use of it and get everything in there. But they wouldn't let me go. So I had to graduate early.
And so between taking all this heavy course load and working, that seems like it must have occupied
a lot of my time.
Yeah. Did you, well, let's see. So as your time as Temple was telling you it was time to leave the nest,
Right.
What were your sort of ideas that you had at that time about what you might do next? What were your kind of ambitions or your vision for your life at that time?
Well, when I was in my last semester at Temple, I actually got pregnant with my oldest daughter, and I married the father of my children, and but he was in graduate school at the time, and so I had to go out and work. And I had made this deal with him, but she never kind of. It never worked out too well. So since I was the breadwinner for many years, and he wanted to live in the manner to which he had become accustomed, rather than me going back to school.
But you had wanted to go back to school.
I did, because when Apollo died down, before I started working with Margaret, I was exploring different things. And so I was exploring, there were some other people at the lab. So I did things like, I got into a little bit of optimal control theory, and I wasn't sure whether I wanted to do that. And then I sat in a course of brainwaves, which I really was interested in. But until I ran across this paper that had this experiment where they took a plastic skull and they sent the brainwave, the electricity through, and got the same exact brain waves that they got from a person. And I said, well, wait a minute, I'm not so sure this is really for me. So,
Well, then, so then you went almost directly from Temple to getting this job at the
That's-
General Electric Space
yes.
Sciences Lab.
right.
Yeah, and could you, and that was in Valley Forge, that was one
in
of my
Valley Forge.
questions.
Yeah.
And could you talk about the lab and what it was,
What it was
what it
like?
was up to and what your job was there?
Sure. We were studying, it was the Cold War days, and so we were studying high temperature air and what happened when a missile would come at you and try to detect whether it was friendly or a foe. So there were a lot of calculations about the airflow around the missiles and stuff like that. So we had to first used, as a lot of people did in those days, the Marchand machine, right? It was a step up from my slide rule, but not much. And then I convinced my boss at the time that maybe we should look at these other things. So there was I think the first one was an LGP-30.
Sure.
I'm sure, but you've heard these stories before about that kind,
Well, I'm
that kind of
familiar with them, but I mean, it's interesting that you were the one bringing that suggestion forward.
To my boss?
Yeah.
I couldn't handle that Marchand machine. It took forever to do like one exponent, chug, 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 chug. Right. Anyway, so and then I heard about this computer room where they were doing Fortran. I didn't know about the fact that Fortran actually, till later, was actually an offshoot from the language that I used when I went to MIT. Did you know that?
Oh, no. Could you explain that connection?
Yeah. When I went, there was a programming language called Mac at the lab, and we used that for simulation purposes. And there were punch cards at the time. And so in order to get one equation, there was 3 punch cards were necessary. One was for the exponent, one was for the body, and one was for the subscripts. So you need 3 punch cards for every equation that you would put into this. But that program was called Mac.
And that was the Michigan something compiler or something. Is that what that stood for?
It was named, I don't know what it was named for, but the man who developed it was Hal Lanning. He was really brilliant.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm sure he's not around anymore. But as a result, IBM came to MIT, and this was before my time there. Sure. But the story is that they came to MIT and looked at that Mac language, which we used, and then they said, well, this is too complicated for normal people. So they took away this and just left the body, which was the beginning. So that's how they came and did Fortran.
Oh, interesting. Well, were you using like the assembly language for the LGP-30 to do your programming there, or did you use at the Space
actually,
Sciences?
it was not assembly language, it was binary.
Binary, okay.
The only advantage was once you did it, you could actually run that program again. Where in the Marchand, you had to keep plugging it. If you did another equation, you had to keep punching all those keys in.
Right.
So there was an advantage.
Right.
Except occasionally the paper tape got unwound. So I remember there was one program I was working on that took most of the weekend. So I started on Friday, and Saturday I went in to see how things were going. And I took my 2 daughters at the time, and they loved it because the paper tape had come off and it was all around the room. And they were stepping on it.
No.
Yeah, I had to run that one over again.
And were there other, so in that work, were there other women doing that similar work in that GE Space Sciences lab, or were you the sole woman there?
There were a couple other women that were doing the Marchand machine. I don't remember anybody exploring computers at the time though, but there were other women using the Marchand.
And where had that suggestion come from? Well, I can understand the motivation to getting away from the Marchand machine
Right.
and all that
Right.
punching, but was it through, I guess, your reading and your education that you had been learning about computers to come up with that suggestion?
I was looking for something that wasn't quite as boring as sitting at that Marchand machine and waiting for this calculation to happen, because it was kind of really boring.
Right.
So I went around the lab and I poked my head in and found these other possibilities.
And then that mainframe that you started to program in Fortran, that was also
That was also
the laboratory?
Yes,
Okay.
right. There was a special room where you had you took your cards and you did this, and then you gave it to a computer operator. So I was used to that when I went to the lab.
Okay.
Except the people at the lab were a little bit more sophisticated, the guys who ran the computer room, because they could tell from the sounds of these computers, which were kind of big, they took up this whole room, right? But they could tell whose program was running. And I'd often get calls in the middle of the night saying, "Saydean, there's something wrong with your program."
Really?
I had to get up, go all the way into the lab, and fix it, because it was messing up other people's programs. Because we all contributed to one computer run at night.
And this is at MIT?
That was at MIT, yeah.
Please go on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Anyway.
So you were at the GE Space Sciences Laboratory until 1965. Is that, or around there?
Around
Sounds
there,
right?
yeah, around there.
And these missiles that you were doing these calculations for, were those for like ICBMs, or were these, was that the context of like nuclear missiles?
Yes, they were trying to determine whether it was a friendly missile or whether it was an enemy missile. And they could tell by the wake of the...
Well, could you talk about, leaving the GE laboratory and moving to Boston?
Sure, I could do that. By this time I had 2 children, right? And my husband he wanted to do a postdoc at Brandeis. And so we moved up. We moved to Boston. That's when we moved there. We stayed. We were originally in Watertown. I don't know if you know the Boston area that much. Oh, okay. So that was our first stop, was Watertown. And I did piecemeal work at home because I had 2 little kids and I still had to support the family. So I did some things like that at home. So I did proofreading, little programming, whatever I could in order to make a little money at that time.
Sort of freelance work.
Right.
Yeah. And then it was, but you didn't do that for all that long, because I believe you joined the MIT's Instrumentation Laboratory in '66. Is that right?
Right.
Could you talk about how that worked, how you came to join that laboratory?
Well, now by this time, my 3rd daughter was born. And she was a bit of a problem. All my kids were born in Philadelphia, or actually born in Philadelphia, because my husband's father was a gynecologist, and he delivered all my kids. Okay, so the first daughter I had was born in 6 hours from my first contraction. The second one, 3 hours. So he was a little worried about the third one. So he said, look, we're going to induce this one. So I went into the hospital, and Mara was a little precocious, and it took her a half an hour. But by that time, my father-in-law at the time was panicked, and he gave me an epidural, but he kind of missed a little bit. Oh. And so my right leg was kind of paralyzed for about 6 months. Oh no. So, but that's when I started looking for real jobs and started working at the lab.
So were you immobile for that time, or could you get around?
I could, but I couldn't drive, you know. And I do remember going to a neurologist, and he said, this is very unusual. Would you write down what happened so I can keep the notes?
Well, we were just talking about, recovering from the delivery of your third daughter, right. And that recovery taking, how long did you say, 6 months?
It took about 6 months. But
yeah.
So I started working for the lab in the fall.
Okay. And did you just find was it through an advertisement that you found out about it?
It was, Boston Globe.
Okay.
Men's section. And I found it, yeah.
There was actually a division between job listings for men and job listings for women in the paper.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so ignorant. I didn't even know.
You didn't even know that?
I did not know that. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those were the days.
So you were looking for technical jobs, so you had to.
So I had to look in the men's section. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And what attracted What attracted that particular listing to you?
Well, it looked like I could do it, and it looked like it had it sounded very interesting. Okay. And when I was at Temple, I remember Kennedy had come to Temple and was doing one of his rallies, and I really was impressed with him at the time. So I thought this was my kind of thing.
And so could you describe sort of the process of landing the job, how that worked?
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's when I met my boss, Fred Martin, and he took me to the cafeteria, and we were standing in line. I said, I'm not sure I can do this. And he said, oh, you can do it. He was really good, yeah. No problem. So I was encouraged, and I took the job.
And so what was your initial role and the responsibilities? If you could talk about maybe the project itself that you were working on and where it fit in the organization.
Okay. I was actually working on the program which fired the engines for the astronauts so that they could change their trajectory on the way to the moon. So Fred would give me some directions and say, this is the kind of thing we need to do, and then I would develop the algorithm and then the program. And then I would formulate it in the Apollo guidance computer language. They had two languages. One was the language that the engineers used, which was an interpretive language, and the other one was closer to machine binary kind of thing. So I had the interpretive kind of language, which was developed by another person at the lab.
And was it Fred who was interfacing with the sort of engineering group that was figuring out sort of the the basics of the engineering problem. That's to say, were you presented with like this is sort of the engineering picture for how this system will operate, or were you in there too as part of that?
I actually was part of formulating the equations that then became part of the Apollo guidance computer.
Okay. So,
but we would talk about it, and then I'd go and figure out what we had to do. So there was two programming aspects. One was the actual program that was going to be on board the computer, that was going to be hardwired, and the other one was the simulation of the universe, so that you could actually test your own program. And that's when we used that language that IBM developed for Transform.
And was that for that simulation of the universe in which the spacecraft and the Apollo guidance computer would be operating, was that a mixture of a simulation that ran on analog computers and on digital computers, or was it a mix there?
No, it was all digital.
Oh, it was all digital.
It was all digital, but we were simulating the animal.
Right.
Right. So there was, you know about the big computer program, the books.
Yes.
Yes. So every night, everybody from the lab that had something to contribute to make a change would actually send their punched cards to the computer room, and then there would be one compilation of that whole book. So if any one particular person made a mistake, then the whole night's work was all finished, right?
Wow.
So that's why they had those things called rope mothers. They were people who kind of did what compilers do. So they manually went through to see whether they could find any errors that would prevent that program from compiling.
And this would be errors in terms of like the syntax, or if you had a parenthesis in the wrong place.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what a rope mother did.
Okay. Wow. And were they looking beyond that to try and find other sorts of errors or bugs?
No, it was all compiler stuff, that you don't need to do anymore in today's world, right?
So in essence, is this written correctly?
Right. Okay. Is it going to hang up the whole thing so that no one will get the results of that night's work?
Interesting. And so you were working on, this control problem for the, I guess, navigation, you would call it, or...
I did a little bit of navigation, but it's mainly the engine burns.
Engine burns, thank you.
Yeah.
How many other people were there working on, routines like the one that you were working on?
There were about 300 people at the lab, working on various aspects. So I did most of my work on the engine burns, but I did a little on re-entry after that. A little bit on navigation, but mostly on the engine burns, and then the re-entry later.
And did that work extend over the various Apollo missions? So was there a continuity of the programs that you were developing?
Yes, there were. Yeah, it was the same program that would then be updated for the next mission. Okay, so I started in Apollo 8, and then my last one was Apollo 11. After that, it was just maintenance. Yeah, and it was right after Apollo 11 that people started, the higher management started leaving the lab. And that's when I was exploring other things like optimal control, brain waves, and see what I was going to do next in my life.
I see. Well, could you tell us a little bit about just your experience of when those missions actually flew? What that was like for you and other people in the
lab?
In the lab, yeah. I mean, it must have been, I imagine, quite an experience.
Yeah, there was a kind of control room that we all went to whenever a mission was going on. Some people actually went down to Houston as part of that, but I was on many Houston trips, but not during the mission control, except for Apollo 11. Apollo 11, I was actually in Florida watching that go off.
Could you talk a little bit about that? Were you there just to observe that, or were you also
I was just there to observe, but since I was part of the development team, I was up real close. I could really feel that rocket go off the ground. Of course, my family came with me too, and the kids remember a little bit. In fact, they had to go to the bathroom, things like that. But but they were there.
Did you ever encounter any sorts of, pardon me, issues with the programs you had worked on, or did everything on the missions run smoothly as far as your software was concerned?
As far as my software was concerned, it was okay.
Yeah, great.
No problems.
And what was could you talk about, was there the interactions between the people working on programs like yours and the team of people who were working on sort of the system software for the Apollo guidance computer? Was there a lot of interchange there, or was it relatively independent?
It was independent.
Okay.
Yeah, it was. But I didn't think that there was anything strange about the fact that it was actually a multi-programmed system, and that was unusual at the time. There wasn't a such thing, right? So there were systems of, as we would do the simulation, there'd be systems of where there were errors and what happened and how it could retrieve it and start over again and so on. I didn't realize that until later. I was working for another company, and Microsoft was just starting out. Well, actually, no, they were around for a little bit, but they had come up with this fantastic new thing called multi-programming. But before that, there wasn't that. And it was interesting. I didn't realize that. It was so sophisticated back in Apollo.
And in your work at the instrumentation laboratory, did you experience any difficulties in pursuing your work or what you wanted to do from sexism or discrimination?
No. There were a lot of women there.
Could you describe a little bit more about that? How would you characterize how many women were there?
I can't remember how many, but there were a lot. There was Margaret, of course, you know her.
Yes.
And then there was another woman who worked closely with us, Laura Sporn, she's not there anymore. But there were quite a few women that worked there at the lab. Of course, I think there were like 300 people they had to hire women because they needed all those people.
Well, let's see. So, and was it Dan Likely who was in charge of the software overall?
Yes.
Okay.
Dan was in charge of it until he left. So I think they left Apollo 13.
Okay.
Right, yeah. So, and it was after that there weren't that many people left, and so Margaret Hamilton took over that job.
And was that group with Dan Likely and the other people from the instrumentation laboratory that went off to form the company Intermetrics, was that kind of what you were talking about when people started to peel out of the instrumentation laboratory?
Right.
Okay.
Well, I would say all the top management left to form Intermetrics.
Okay, it was really that.
It was really that, and they were developing a higher order language called HAL. Okay, and HAL was the shuttle language, and it was named after Hal Lanning, who had developed the languages that we used to develop Apollo.
Okay. And could you talk a little bit more about what that orientation of Intermetrics was, to the extent that you know about it? So this higher order language that they were developing, was this a language that was designed to be very much error proof and things like that? Or what was kind of the take? What was the thesis of Intermetrics?
They definitely were trying to develop a higher order language that would be easier to use, not so error prone as all the stuff that we went through, which was there was a lot of testing, always testing, right? And at the time, a lot of people who worked at the lab tried to do these little tricky things that no one could figure out. It was those days. So the higher order language was something that would prevent a lot of that.
Right.
And they must have had some sort of inside track, because they kind of left right after that. Because they knew the lab had to transfer knowledge. They weren't going to be working too much directly on the shuttle.
Okay. So was it around the time that those folks left to form Intermetrics that you and Margaret Hamilton began to work together on this study about the software for the Apollo missions? Didn't you do kind of a...
We did do that, but that was the first thing I did was try to explore other things, right? Okay, but then somehow I guess I walked by Margaret's office one day and we got to talking, because people were down. There was nothing exciting happening anymore. Like this one guy, Don Isles, who's still around, we had some sort of weekly meetings, and he got on the table and stood on his head because he didn't know what else to do. So we thought, well, maybe we could, and we kind of talked about it a little bit, because I had not worked with Margaret before that, right? I knew she was there somewhere, but since she was in the systems software part, I never really had much to do with her before that. And so we said, well, if we kind of analyze all the problems that happen, maybe people would get interested, give them something exciting to do. And that's what we did.
Could you talk a little bit about how you did that study? How was it that you...
Oh, we got everybody involved, so they would go through the programs, try to figure out why it had a problem. Okay, and we divided them into different categories. And we found a lot of them, like 3/4 could have been prevented, those problems, if they had some sort of more sophisticated tool around.
And these were the problems that were essentially caused by the interface between
things.
Between things.
So it could be people, machine to machine, software to software.
And that was, were you surprised by that finding?
Yes. Yeah, we were. But it was interesting because it gave us an opportunity to develop a system that would prevent those kind of things.
And was that kind of the next step from that study?
From that study. Because what happened is the people at the lab by that time, there were no software people left, very few. Most of them were hardware people, and they really weren't interested in software. Mm-hmm. So that's why we left and formed our own company.
Okay. And this was about 1976, but you had started on developing this kind of higher order software at the instrumentation laboratory.
We were at the lab, but the lab didn't care because they were not software people. Okay. So we took it with us.
And could you help me and help other people who watch this interview understand kind of the approach of the higher order software? Was this a kind of a system in which you could almost like derive a program and know that it was, reliable and going to work properly? Could you just, in a kind of simple way, describe how it worked?
Well, what we did is we came up with a set of what we called axioms, which were the basis of this computer system that we developed, where if you use that to do your software, or even just think about the problems, then it could actually analyze whether it made sense or whether it was going to cause a problem. So and it was developed knowing that most of the problems were those interface problems.
So it was in some ways like a design methodology for...
Right, it was.
Okay.
But we developed it as a language also, so that people could actually graphically input this information.
And you could implement it.
And then you could implement it from there.
Okay. Fascinating. And well, could you talk about that decision to leave the laboratory, the instrumentation laboratory, and take that project,
with
outside? What was that discussion like?
Well, we thought they wouldn't care because no one really was interested in software anymore, because all the people went to Intermetrics that were. So, but we weren't quite sure. So we kind of left in the middle of the night. Packed up our things. And the guards kind of helped us.
Oh, wow. Literally packed up your things.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But we did there were a few little contracts that the lab gave to us because they didn't have anybody to do them. Okay, so that helped out in the beginning. And then we did a lot of work for the government.
What about the decision to take that project, to make a startup to pursue that versus maybe, find a home in a university or something like that for the project?
Well, the people in the university weren't really that friendly to us at the time because we didn't have PhDs.
Okay. So they couldn't,
they
weren't creative enough to see a place.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So we we had to do that. And I don't think we even thought about it, but we just said, look, this is what we got to do. So I cashed in my MIT pension plan money, and we started a company in a basement on Mass Avenue.
And was it initially a partnership, or did you organize it as a company straight away?
We organized it as a company, but the stock was 50-50.
Okay. And what kind of computing and other resources did you need to continue this? How did you get access to computing?
That was the days of DEC computing. Remember? I don't know if you know.
Do.
You do?
DEC, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so they actually provided us with some machines. As a loan. As a loan,
wow.
Yeah.
And did that give them a kind of a stake in the company, or are they just...
No.
Oh, wow.
No. They were trying to get people to use DEC machines at the time.
Makes sense.
I don't know what happened to them. They were a really good company.
Yeah, they kind of...
But they kind of fizzled out.
Yeah, got acquired, I think, in the end by Compaq.
Oh, did they?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I didn't remember that.
Oh. Well, could you talk about, so was the initial work was on contracts.
Right.
Was that the work that you were doing for the US government, was that most of the business? Contracts?
It was most of the business, and the reason we did that is because I don't know what it is like today. Well, of course, today's kind of really weird, but we won't go in that one. But in those days, if you had a government contract, there was a certain percentage of it that you could use for research. And that's why we liked the government contracts, because we wanted to develop our own language, our own system. And if we did work for the government, we could use some of that money to do that.
Could you describe how your role evolved at the company? What particular things that you worked on?
Well, Margaret and I worked on everything together. That's the way we worked. So we wrote all these papers together. She insisted on being first author because she was older. That's okay. I didn't mind. So we wrote lots of papers and got them published. And the first paper we published was on higher software, and that was in the very first edition of the IEEE software engineering. Right. So somebody had come up with the term software engineering before us, but
you were right there.
We were right there. Volume 1. I think it was there was a man who was part of, he was in research, I can't remember his name now. He was in research in the Army, I think. And he's the one who started that particular journal, the Systems Software Journal.
And then as things progressed, did you come up also with, in addition to having these contracts, did you develop a product?
That's what we were working on with the research money.
Okay.
Okay, so we were trying to develop this product. Okay. Which was, we called it Use It, which is an awful name now. I don't know why we came up with that. Not very exciting, but that was it. And apparently, we were just doing work for the government, and we got a phone call from this guy. His name was Tony Sun, and he was part of this venture capital company called Venrock. I don't know if they're still around.
Yeah, they are.
Are they?
Yep.
Probably Probably Tony's son's not around. But anyway, he came to see us because he had read one of our initial papers, and he wanted to invest. And we said, I don't know whether we want to have an outside investor, because we had research money from the government, and we didn't really need that, right? But we thought about it for a while, and then he said, but you can do it faster if you had this money, right? So we thought about it, and we were thinking about it, and then there was one of the guys that was at the lab who came to work with us. His name was Peter Mimno. I don't know if he's still around or not.
I don't know. What was the name again?
Peter Mimno. He was.
I don't know.
Anyway, he also ran sailing boats from Marblehead over to Bermuda in spare time.
Nice.
Okay. And Peter said, he said, there's this guy who has this big house in Bermuda, and he's got lots of money. And his name was Jim Martin. I don't know if you ever heard of Jim Martin.
I haven't.
Jim Martin, and this was the late 70s, he was making $10 million a year giving seminars to business people. That's a lot of money in those days. So he had a really nice house in Bermuda. And he had lots of money. So Peter, when he went over on the sailboat, he knocked on the door and said, I've got this proposition for you. And so Jim Martin was he was British. And in person, he was very, very quiet. But something happened to him on the stage, because he'd get up on the stage and wow, people would love it. And he would walk down this carpet onto the stage. He was a real good showman, but I don't know. But every time we talked to him, he was very quiet. It was just something happened to him.
Yeah.
I could never do that. Not my thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, he said, look, I have the money, you don't need Venrock. I'll do it all myself, right? I said, well, I don't know if we want to do that either, right? So we had the two of them together.
Okay.
And we allowed them to invest. And that's what started us off on our money raising projects as well. So we raised all our money in those days.
Was it something like 9 million or something that you raised? That figure sticks out in my mind.
It could have been 9 million. It might have been more. I think it was 13 million when we were done. Okay.
And then did you use that to expand the staff?
We did, yes. Well, we went from our little basement, we moved across the street to bigger quarters, and then we moved into this other building in Porter Square. And by that time, we had lots and lots of people. There was about a couple hundred people in the company by that time.
And this was the push to develop Use It.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We had a sales component, and right. And we had lots of customers at the time.
Could you talk about who they were, or characterize the type of
customer
that you had?
Yeah, they were typically big, I'm trying to remember all the customers that we had, if I could characterize. There was one company I remember, I don't know if they're still around. The reason I'm thinking about them is later on, I went to see this company called System Development Corporation. Are they still around?
Out here?
No, they're out here.
Interestingly enough, I think they wound down that company because it was a federally funded I don't know what they called it. It was like a federally created company, you know, it was initially to do the software for the Sage system, SDC.
Yeah, it was a big company.
Huge. And yeah, they created this. Yeah. Anyway, it's an
Anyway.
interesting story into itself. Yeah.
But I only remember that because when we came to visit them here, when I drive by the Santa Monica airport, I remember taking a little puddle jumper and going into the Santa Monica airport to go visit SDC.
Mm-hmm.
But so I was wondering whether they were still around. But
but there's an interesting story with that.
oh, okay,
yeah.
another day.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Another day.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so it was a big software producing
Companies, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. IBM, ITT. Yeah, ITT was our downfall.
Could you talk about that?
About the downfall?
Well, about
Sure.
why ITT?
Oh, well, there was this guy. His name was Jim Frame, and he was some VP at ITT, and he was really interested in our company. And this was right after. I guess I missed one part of it, but there was a time when there was a company called EDS.
Ross
Perot's company. And Ross had a president, Mort Meyerson. I don't know if you know him at all. Well, EDS did lots of billing for healthcare companies. And they were in a situation where they weren't expanding very much. And so Ross Meyerson wanted to get a company who could help them get things done more efficiently.
I see.
So he came to see us, and he wanted to buy higher order software. And of course the investors said, don't do it, don't do it. You know, it was either us or Microsoft. Microsoft kind of won. But anyway, he offered us, this was mid-70s, right? Or mid-80s, beginning, about 82, yeah, it was about 82.
Right.
So he offered us $40 million for their company. And of course, the investors didn't want us to do this. But we thought, we still had owned half the company. That was a pretty good sum in those days. Mm-hmm. But it was nixed by Mr. Perot.
Okay.
Because we would have been the highest stockholders after him. And he didn't want two women being big stockholders.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
Surprise.
the deal fell apart?
The deal fell apart. Then they came back and offered us $20 million instead of 40. And the guy that was doing the negotiating for us said, don't do it. So we didn't.
And then ITT comes into the picture a little bit later?
Oh, and then yes, because then things started going downhill a little bit, the company. And the investors said, well, you need to bring in some professional management. So there was this guy who was from ITT, and he came to work for the company, and he was Jim Frame was his name, and he was a big company person. Mm-hmm. And we only had we didn't have that much money. Right. We didn't have IT&T type money. But we had an investment of like $3 million from the investors, and he spent it in 9 months. and that was big money in those days.
Yeah. And then what happened?
Well, then he was let go by the investors, and we kind of had to downsize. Mm-hmm. And then the investors said, "Well, why don't you women go back and do some research, and we'll hire some professional management." Again. So they did that, and I said, "Well," and Margaret didn't want to do research. I was all for it. I was going to say, "Hey, it sounds like fun to me," right? Mm-hmm. But she didn't want to do that. So they allowed me to sell some of my stock, so I could do whatever I wanted to do next in life. But I stayed on the board. But they didn't allow Margaret to, because they were really mad at her. So
they were mad at her for not agreeing to go do research with.
Well, they weren't too happy with her. Okay. So she was on the board also afterwards, and they hired this professional manager. By this time, I was divorced, and I wanted to meet this guy. So we had lunch one day, and it turned out to be a 4-hour lunch, and I eventually wound up marrying him. He was my second husband. So he ran the company for a few years, but it was so much in debt that he couldn't overcome it.
Also, in debt to banks or to
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the investors didn't want to make another round.
They didn't want to do it, even though they had hired this guy. Mm-hmm. But they didn't want to do it. And
so what happened to the company? It wound down, or
it went bankrupt.
Okay.
And his name was Ted Watson. And so that's how we got to Maine.
Okay.
We decided he was trying to decide whether to close the company down or not. So we said, well, we'll go take a weekend drive somewhere. And one of the women who worked as administrative help, we went out to dinner with her and her husband, and she said, "Why don't you drive up to Moosehead Lake in Maine? That'll give you something to do." We never got to Moosehead Lake, but we did wind up in the middle of Maine, or then on the coast, and we said, if we just sold our houses, we could retire, which is what we did for a while.
And when you made that decision, you bought a bed and breakfast, is that right? Or was that
was
different?
a little bit. No, it was a little bit later. Oh,
okay.
Well, first we found we found 2 houses in Down East Maine for a total price of $150,000, and they were on 10 acres of land on a salt marsh. And at the time, my middle daughter and her husband and my granddaughter, who was a little kid at the time, they were living up in the attic of this house I had in Belmont. Mm-hmm. And this property had these 2 houses. They could have their own little house. We could have the bigger house, right? So for $150,000, we bought it. And that's how we came to Maine originally.
Okay.
A long time ago. And then we did retire for about a year.
Right, I was going to say.
And then we got bored.
A short-lived retirement.
Right, so then I remember Ted saying, I've always wanted to have a bed and breakfast. So we went and found one.
And that's how you got to...
Well, that's how we went to Bar Harbor, because we went to Bar Harbor for a year and a half. And then we were called back to the software business.
Now, could you talk about that? Now, was that... You had... what was Touchstone Engineering? I read about that somewhere.
Yeah. How'd you find that one?
I don't know, being diligent somehow, seeing some reference somewhere.
Oh, okay. Well, I
Yeah.
used the money that I was able to sell my stock quarterly. Okay, I think it was like $30,000 a quarter. And I started this little company called Touchstone Engineering with another woman. This was Cynthia Solomon. I think she might still be around. But Cynthia was originally, she worked with Seymour Papert on that. There was a programming language for kids called Logo.
Sure.
Well, she developed that with Seymour Papert.
Okay.
And so she had done a little bit of work with HOS for a while, but when I left, the two of us started Touchstone Engineering. And the idea was to develop this graphical tool that would be workflow related, okay, for businesses who then would kind of use it for collaboration and for optimization for personnel and stuff.
I see, but with the emphasis on the graphical
Yes.
interface or representation. I see.
So she had some connections with like Symbolics. Do you remember
Sure,
Symbolics?
of course.
So Symbolics gave us a graphical computer with this big giant screen. And that's what we were developing. Not us personally, but Cynthia had a nephew, Eric, and he was friends with my oldest daughter. And so Eric came to live in my house in Belmont, Massachusetts, and then he'd go down to the basement and he'd work on Touchstone Engineering work. Okay, and that was kind of fun. It was a good project, but it didn't really take off too well.
Okay.
Okay, so
And then you sort of wound that down when you made the move to Maine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, Steve Jobs gave us a computer too. It was before the graphics. Cynthia was friends with Steve Jobs because remember he did all this giving away of computers to the schools and stuff.
Right.
Yeah. So he gave us one too.
Was that one of the next computers or?
No, that was, it wasn't even graphic.
Oh. Hmm.
We had to develop our own graphics for that. I can't remember the name of that one. It was I don't know. I don't remember the name of it. But it was a computer for free. For free.
So after moving to Bar Harbor and having this bed and breakfast, we're in 1989 or thereabouts.
Right.
Then you become involved with a company called TSI. Could you talk about that?
Oh, yes. When Ted was part of Dun & Bradstreet, he was the president of some division, but Dun & Bradstreet before I knew him. He also had worked with this woman, Connie Galley. And when Ted left, she took over as president of this little company. And it was a company that did key punch operations.
Okay.
And she thought key punching was going out of style a little bit. And she wanted to get into this newfangled software called electronic data interchange, which was a way of using software in some standard way to get business documents interchanged between different companies. But they had a little problem, okay, because this particular format was developed by a group of people, okay, and they had to put the documents in this particular format, purchase orders, invoices, and so on. But to do that, they needed to get the information out of their old COBOL programs and put it into this format in order to send it between different vendors. And so that kind of intrigued me because they were having all sorts of problems doing that, because a lot of times the instructions from the old COBOL programs were missing. They only had the results.
Okay.
They only saw what came out. So it was really hard for them to develop a program to put it into this other format.
Mm-hmm.
So that seemed like an interesting problem to me. And the investors in TSI Connie wanted to buy this little company in Chicago. And because they had developed this little program for EDI, electronic data interchange. And so she wanted to get into this new thing. Mm. But they wouldn't do that unless Ted ran the company. Huh. So she enticed us both. He could run the company, and I could develop this product. So,
and this is again kind of back to interfaces in a way, right?
Right. Right. So we were off to Chicago.
You moved to Chicago.
We moved to Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah, and we had in the beginning there was a couple women that had worked with us at the inn, and they were going to run it for us. Eventually, my middle daughter took over.
Okay.
Okay, so that was okay. That was running fine, and we were in Chicago.
And so how did that story play out?
That's actually I thought that was more interesting than Apollo, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
How so, please?
Because it was a really interesting problem of how people would get the information when they didn't have the program to start with, right? And get it into this other format. So when I looked at it, I said, oh, you don't need to do that. All you have to do is look at the data. So we developed this program, this graphical program, where you could describe the data, not the program, mm-hmm. and then convert it to whatever format you wanted to. And that took off really well.
So the graphical interface would help you parse in a way the data that you had and right, map it into the new thing.
Right, and then the new thing would also be described as data, not as the program, right, as data. Because they had, the purchase order, the invoice, whatever, right? Right,
okay. And that effort really took off.
That took off, yeah. And that company later became known as Mercator.
Right. And you were there when Mercator went public.
Yes, I was.
And you were the chief technology officer there?
Yes.
Okay. How could you, by the time it went public, could you just describe sort of, where we were in terms of head count and revenue, just roughly?
Well, the company grew. In the R&D division, which I was running, there were about 200 people in that division by then.
In R&D?
In R&D, yeah.
And could you just talk about that experience? Was that the largest R&D group that you had run to that point?
Yes.
Yeah. What was that experience like?
That was exciting. I liked that. Was more exciting actually than Apollo to me. Because eventually that program, which where you could describe the data, not the program, was generic. So people were using it for all sorts of things.
To map
data from one point to other forms of data. In fact, IBM came. They had this really interesting problem because they came to a trade show and saw this. They said you could never do this, but the problem is they had companies that all they had were cashier tapes, and they didn't know the program behind where the cashier tapes were. And some of it was binary, some of it was text, some of it was the name of the cashier who was running it. So they used it to decipher those cashier tapes.
Wow.
And convert that to whatever form they needed to for business purposes. So they were a really good customer of us.
So as the software became more generic for, mapping data in one form to putting it into another form, that its uses also expanded
it was used,
tremendously.
Yeah, in fact, there were a lot of there were a lot of big companies and some small ones, because that was in the days where Microsoft was a customer, Amazon was a customer. That was the days when we went to see Amazon, because they also wanted to be able to send business documents in those days, and they were kind of tiny. And Jeff Bezos came in to talk to us, and he said, well, these are the people that are going to do the interface, the programming, but when they're in the afternoon, they had to go package things up. They were that
startup.
small.
Yeah.
That was really small. Right, and then they were nice people in those days, because they used to call me at midnight, and I'd be still at the office, right? And they loved that, right? Because they had finished packing, and now they were back doing software.
How had the practice of developing software, so by the time you were running that group at Mercator, what was it like, just the difference between creating software there and, compare that to like the instrumentation laboratory? Was it?
Well, to me, it wasn't much different. I don't know why, but it wasn't. But it was a commercial venture, so there's money involved, right? Right. But other than that, I mean, the people that I had working for me were pretty good people.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking more in terms of like the languages and the tools. And
that was the beginning of XML. In fact, one of the things that we developed was some sort of messaging system that you could describe the data from and going back and forth. Mm. And IBM really liked that one, because they had a messaging product that they couldn't convert from one form to another.
That wasn't when they had. Did they have Lotus Notes by now?
Lotus Notes was before that.
Right, but IBM bought that at or I guess it's after this time.
Yeah. Because we did use Lotus Notes for something, but that one really died, didn't it? Oh well, that was fun. Guess Microsoft won that one.
Well, we were talking about Mercator, and I was wondering if you could talk about, now, did IBM eventually did purchase Mercator? Is that correct? Yeah. When was that?
I had already left by then.
Okay. When did you leave? Could you talk about when you left and why?
Sure. Okay, here we were, high-rolling company. My husband, Ted, at the time, knew he was losing his memory, and so he sold a lot of his stock, which was very convenient for us. Okay, and he left the company, and the treasurer at the time had just discovered that he had prostate cancer, and they went in to operate, and they couldn't operate. So he wasn't thinking too clearly and made a mistake on the quarterlies. As a result, the company kind of, because of that incident, it kind of went downhill.
Oh gosh, it got, yeah.
So luckily, we got out, because for some reason Ted got out at the right time. Okay, and eventually it just went downsized, and eventually was sold to one company. I can't even remember its name, and then IBM bought it.
Okay.
But I don't think they knew what to do with it once they bought it, right?
Wow.
But this was in the high-flying early 2000s,
Right.
before the big crash. Yeah.
Well, when you decided to leave, you returned to Maine?
Oh, what did we do? We actually did return to Maine. Well, we were in Florida by that. Wait, we were in Florida at the time. So we had a place in Florida, and then we still had the old place in Maine. So we kind of went back and forth, and because when we were in Chicago, Ted had a heart attack, and he was coming home from some business meeting, and he was knocking the icicles off the roof and had a heart attack.
Oh, no.
So that's why we moved to Florida, because it was warmer and it was right near IBM. So we could get lots of developers.
Okay.
So that's where we had the R&D facility. Was now not in Chicago anymore, but it was in Florida.
Where in Florida?
In the Boca Raton area, because that was right near IBM.
Okay, yeah, that's right, yeah.
Right, so we got lots of developers from there.
Okay. And after you left Mercator, have you pursued other technology projects since that time, or?
No.
No.
I have not.
Yeah.
That was my last hurrah.
Well, could you talk about your interests and activities that you've pursued since then? What have you been? What has held your attention since then?
Well, for a long time, we actually built this house in Maine that, if you want to come visit. But we had lived in about 22 different places before that together. And so we took the best of each one and we built. So I had spent a lot of time working with the contractor and the architect, and we had this program. It was called, I think it's still around, it was called Chief Architect. And we could actually communicate 3D designs for this house. So I spent some time doing that.
That's great.
In the early, mid 2000s, right.
Great. Well, let's see. I wanted to ask you then, well, is there any other question I should have asked you about your career but have neglected to so far?
I don't think so. I think you probably covered most of it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you some questions, if it's okay with you, that are just more reflections about your career. And one thing I wanted to ask you was, I was interested to know how you see the type of work that you began with higher order software. How do you see that kind of work playing out and continuing today? Where do you see that sort of approach living today?
Today I have not been in contact with the computing industry since the mid 2000s, early on. So I cannot answer that question.
Okay. But while you were still active, did you see that kind of, designing against error from the outset, the sort of use of design methodologies, had that become more widespread?
It had become more widespread. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I was wondering,
With all the,
oh,
you know,
I'm sorry.
with all the programming for the web and all that. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
I was wondering what interests you today about the world of computing. Are there things going on today that you think are particularly exciting as you follow things as?
Well, the AI world.
Yeah.
That's where it is today. Yeah. Interesting. We'll see where that goes.
Do you have any thoughts about where that might go?
No, I don't know because it's new. It's
Yeah.
new. It's new.
And I wanted to ask you about what you think is most important to promote women's participation in computing. You know, there's a lot of, well, I just was wondering your take on that.
Well, I haven't been, in computing for a few years now.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was in computing, for some reason my partners turned out to be all women. I don't know why. Okay, so I think I think they're there. Just I don't know what's going on actually in the world today with women out there.
The question was motivated just because you see, in enrollment and things like computer science, that women are still very much sort of underserved and underrepresented in, the sort of academic study of computer science.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that it doesn't represent, it's not representative. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about the culture of computing that may, relate to that, or.
No, because I thought the culture of computing was changing. Since I had lots of women working for me, and the president was a woman, so I thought things were changing.
Yeah, well, they certainly have, but I guess I was just wondering
In fact,
about the struggles that
the
remain.
woman who was in charge of the consulting part of the business,
Mm-hmm.
who worked with our product, she was a woman too. So I thought things were changing.
Yeah. Well, they certainly have. Yeah.
Of course, we don't have a woman president yet. I'm waiting for that.
And I was just wondering, reflecting back on your career, just some things that have been particularly meaningful to you in your career, both as a technical person, but also as an entrepreneur. What really things on a personal level have meant a lot to you about that experience?
Oh, they're kind of all mixed together. Okay, so I'm not sure how to answer that question.
Yeah, I guess I was just looking for what sort of aspects of your career that you have found very meaningful. Whether that's working with other people or advancing technology. Just if something like that stands out for you, is kind of what I was digging for there. Yeah.
It's always been looking for new technology.
Mm-hmm.
Get kind of bored if you keep doing the same thing over and over again.
That's for sure. And And this is a question that we ask many of our interviewees. It's about one word of advice. And the question is, you know, if you could give only one word of advice to somebody just starting out on their career, you know, what would that one word or idea be, and why?
Don't listen to other people, just listen to your inner self.
Do you think that's something that's really characterized your story?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, I think that's everything I had on my question list, but is there anything else that you'd like to talk about that we haven't covered, or anything else that you
I think
might
we've
like
covered.
to add? Yeah.
I think we've covered a lot.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has been great.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.